All right, we have a jam-packed session this morning on AI prototyping. So I know folks are still joining us, but I'm actually going to jump right in as we're waiting for folks to join us. So, who am I? Some of you may know me, some of you may not. My name is Sachin Rekhi, and I'm the founder of a startup called NoteJoy, which is a note-taking app for individuals and teams. But I also love talking product management. And so I have a popular blog at sachinrekhi.com where I share essays on product. But more recently, I've spent time creating a bunch of courses on product management through Reforge. So you can see a few of them mentioned here: AI productivity, mastering product management, and product innovation strategy. Before this, I've kind of spent my career balanced between startups as well as large companies. Most recently, I incubated LinkedIn Sales Navigator at LinkedIn, grew that, and now I'm back to the startup world. So that's enough about me, but let's talk about what we're going to cover today in this morning's session. So one of the key things we're going to be talking about is why prototype, right? So why is this AI prototyping notion that some of you must have heard of, why is it important and why is it beneficial? But I want to quickly get into debunking some of the common myths. I'm starting to see folks actually using AI prototyping not in what I consider the best ways. And so I want to talk to what some of those common myths that are already starting to percolate, even though this is sort of an early field. We're going to spend the bulk of our time this morning actually showing you a demo of how to build a prototype from 0 to 1. So I really want to make sure you guys can walk away with this session empowered to go do this on your own. We'll then spend some time talking about, now that you built a prototype, what do you even do with that prototype, right? What's the point of these prototypes? How are you going to use them? And we'll also dive into what tools are available in the market for prototyping and some of my takes on the ones that are the most interesting to look at. We'll talk about, now that you've had sort of the 0 to 1 on prototyping, where do you go from here in terms of skill development? And I have this mastery ladder kind of encouraging the various skills that you need to know to really take your prototyping skills to the next level. And we'll end our day here with Q&A. So we'll be using the Q&A tab here. So I'd encourage you to have that open and ask questions throughout, and we'll have time at the end for those questions. Saw a question here on whether this session is going to be recorded, and yes, it will definitely be recorded, and you'll have access to it afterwards. So this session is only going to scratch the surface on AI prototyping. And so if you want to go deeper, I do want to let you know about a course that I'm offering in the fall called AI Productivity. It has a major component of it, which is AI prototyping, specifically how to go deep and become a true master at AI prototyping. But mostly it's about how, as a PM, do you get great at using AI tools for all parts of your job, whether it's product strategy, customer and data insights, prototyping, or product execution. And so would really encourage you guys to check this out. Our fall cohort is actually starting October 14th, and you can find more information on the Reforge website about that. So let's dive in. As I mentioned, where I wanted to start was answering this question of why prototype? Why is prototyping important in the first place? And so one way I can make this argument is really an evolutionary argument about where we are. And so when we think about the days I started as a PM, I remember when I was at Microsoft, I used to write 30-page specs with lots of details about error conditions and whatnot. But the world has moved on from that. What we now typically do is write lighter weight specs and actually leverage the fact that we can create design mock-ups that really detail what the experience is. As they always say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's this idea that the design mock-up is a higher fidelity version of us to communicate and debate what the right product experience is. And so we've already seen this shift to leveraging designs heavily and relying less on sort of detailed PRDs as the way we communicate our product designs. Prototyping is really the next evolution of that. That now we're saying, hey, let's go beyond a static mock-up and get into actual interactions, maybe even prototyping functionality, and using that as an even higher fidelity medium by which we're actually communicating to our engineers, our executive stakeholders, to customers to get better feedback, to better explain what the experience we want to build is. And so in that way, it's sort of an evolution of where we've already been to higher and higher fidelity deliverables of the product role. Now, I do want to make this argument that actually, when you really embrace prototyping, I think it goes beyond evolutionary argument and really becomes revolutionary. And let me kind of explain why. One of the common things that we do when we're prioritizing is we typically start with customer problems. We're doing our customer research, we're trying to understand what the biggest problems to solve are, and then we decide what those big problems to solve are, and then we put them on the roadmap. And after that, we get to designing solutions. Now, that's fine, but actually what I've noticed is the very best companies do something different. They do something called product shaping. And it's this notion that, hey, what if we prototype a bunch of solutions, see how those solutions resonate with customers, and then prioritize on the roadmap the best not only problem to solve for the customer, but one with a really great solution attached to it. So the classic story I love to talk about this is Apple. Johnny Ive and the team were spending years, frankly, working on a touch interface for tablets, trying to make it so you can really use your finger to touch the tablet. Now, when Steve Jobs saw this, he said this technology would be amazing for an iPhone, not a tablet. They shelved all the tablet work they were doing, and then they ultimately decided to build the iPhone. The rest is history here. But what I'm saying here is they didn't decide to prioritize build a tablet and then see what they got on the other end. They prototyped many different things to then ultimately decide what was going to be the best experience. Now, only companies like Apple, Stripe, and Amazon have been doing this. Why doesn't everyone do this? It's really expensive to run a prototyping lab. Now, with the power of AI, all of us could be prototyping cheaply and starting to think about prioritizing based on the fidelity and quality and the reception of our prototypes, as opposed to just prioritizing based on the problems that we're solving for our customers. And so I think once we get to here, and I'm starting to see teams already doing this, this really changes the way we're prototyping and becomes really interesting. All right, now let's talk about some of the myths associated with prototyping. Now, one thing I often hear is people think about these prototypes that we can build as PMs as a way to speed up delivery. And it's this idea, hey, we can build this prototype, hand it over to engineering, they can run with it, and we're going to be off to the races of getting this feature into production faster than ever. Now, that, in my opinion, is not the right way to use or think about prototypes. Let's be honest, the technology is not there yet. You can't vibe code a prototype, hand it to engineering, and expect them to actually use that code, because it's not going to meet security requirements, scalability requirements, robustness, all the things that actually we leverage our engineering team to do well. And so I don't think the way to think about these prototypes is as a delivery tool, but instead as a product discovery tool. The idea is these prototypes get us way faster to understanding our customers, what we could possibly build for those customers, validating with our customers, and making it so we can build a better solution faster. And so it's that discovery process that's being accelerated by AI prototyping, not necessarily delivery. Now, of course, on the delivery side, there's so many great AI tools for engineers to speed up their own productivity, but that's not how I think about AI prototyping in particular. Now, the other common way I see people talking about prototyping is that it's this great way to take this idea in my head and get it on paper really quickly, right? And so they're trying to get that specific instantiation of the idea into a actual prototype. Now, you can certainly do that, but man, you are missing a whole value of prototypes if that's all you're doing. I think the key way to use these tools is to diverge before you converge. And what that means is to use it to come up with multiple ideas, multiple directions that you can go in, and then start selecting which direction makes the most sense. And so it shouldn't be just about coming up with what's already envisioned in your head, but in fact, using it to come up with multiple ideas. And I'll start to show you how you can use these tools to diverge as opposed to just implement your specific idea. Now, some folks have also been talking about how prototypes are going to completely replace PRDs and mockups and become the core and only deliverable that teams are going to need. Now, I don't think that's the way things are going to go. Let me explain why. I think, for example, with PRDs, the prototype doesn't actually answer the question, does this feature fit into our product strategy? And you still need the PRD to answer that, right? You might build a prototype, you might get great customer feedback, they love it. But this idea that, is this feature going to help differentiate against our competition, for example, is a strategy question, which you can't answer from a prototype alone. And so I still think there's a place for PRDs. Now, I do think PRDs can get lighter. They can look like these 1 to 2 page product briefs as opposed to very detailed specs. But I don't think they go away entirely. The other thing I'll call out here is that I don't think they replace mockups. And so here's why. What you'll find is that prototypes are kind of in this weird place where they're sort of mid-fidelity. They're definitely higher than low fidelity because you have interactions, you might even have functionality, but getting them to be high fidelity, getting them to be pixel perfect is actually very difficult. And so from that sense, if we need pixel perfect mockups, I do think it's going to be important for us to continue to build those mockups. Now, some of the tools like Magic Patterns even actually lets you, once you've built your prototype, export it to Figma to support that workflow of now we want to actually clean up that and get it pixel perfect for delivery to our engineering team. So that's sort of the third myth that I think is important to think about here. All right, so we've talked about why prototype, some of the myths with prototyping. I now want to jump right into a demo of showing you how to actually use these tools to prototype. We're going to be showing off one of the popular AI prototyping tools called Bolt. But afterwards, I'll talk about sort of the landscape of tools to give you some recommendations on tools that you might want to check out. Now, the first thing I want to do is open up Bolt. And what you'll see is pretty much all these tools start with an open text box that allows us to provide a prompt to ultimately start building our prototype. Now, the first thing I'm going to have it do is actually create a baseline for NoChoy, the application that I built. And so let me fire that off because the command's going to take a little while, and then I'm explain a little bit what I'm trying to do here. So I'm going to tell it here, recreate the following screenshot. I'm going to give it a screenshot of my product. So this is NoChoy, the note-taking app that I built, typical note-taking app with 3 columns. And so now I'm going to actually hand it that screenshot and say, let's go ahead and recreate the following screenshot. Okay, so this is going to take a little bit of time, but let me explain why I'm doing this. Now, as people begin using prototyping tools, the number one concern I see from people is, hey, I built a prototype, but it doesn't look anything like my product. How do I actually get the product to look like a feature inside my existing product? How do I get it to leverage my design system, my styles, and whatnot? And so that's why the best practice I'm encouraging right now is the right way to think about this, which is we want to start by preloading the prototyping tool with our existing app styles and design. And then from there, we're actually going to start iterating to build new features on top of it. Now, there's a couple of ways we could do that. One is the way that I've shown you here, where you can just give it a screenshot of your main application and ask it to recreate it. That's approach one. Approach number two is you can actually have it to ultimately also grab your Figma file. So they have Figma importers that will import your Figma and actually recreate it. The interesting thing is, I don't find that the fidelity of a Figma import is actually any better than a screenshot. And so often you can still just use a screenshot to import that design. Some of the tools even let you sort of scrape um, actual components from your live website. Magic Patterns even has a extension that lets you do this. And so those are the sort of various ways that you can bring your existing design into the interface. And that's always the place to start. So let's take a look at what Bolt did here. So it took that screenshot and then it's saying, I'm seeing that you have a couple core features here. You got a dark theme sidebar. You have a main roadmap document area. And it's capturing a bunch of the design elements here. Things like subtle shadows, rounded corners, clean typography. And then it's gone and basically recreated my app. Now, it's kind of amazing what it's basically done here. It's taken this static screenshot and translated it to front-end code. HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and actually recreated the application, even with hover effects here, with the note content panel, the note list, as well as this panel on the left here for my sidebar. And so it's recreating a bunch of the application. So it's done a decent job. Now, it's not perfect, and we're going to want to refine this to actually make this better. Now, there's a couple of interesting prompts you can do to do this, but let me show you simple things. So if you notice, the sidebar background color isn't exactly kind of like the background color of the application. So I can start giving it instructions like this, which is let's set the background color to the specific hex color of the background. You know, maybe I know this because my design team told me this. Maybe I just go to my application and inspect it in Chrome to get that. But I can now go fire it off and have it make those incremental changes to improve the baseline that we're starting with here. So it's going to fire off, go make that change for me. And it says it'll go update the background color. It's updating the appropriate code. And you can see already that it's come back and changed that. So you can see you can give it very specific prompts to ultimately improve your actual prototype. Now, you'll find that the round trip it takes to answer your questions, you're kind of sitting there waiting. And so one of the techniques I like to use is just batch some edits. So you can see here, I'm telling it, set the note list background to this color, set the note content background to this color. And so now I can fire off a couple of updates I want it to go make. And then it will go make those faster than if I try to send those to it incrementally. And so now it's going to go do that, make those updates. And so we're going to get now the actual colors on the sidebars match our actual application. Now, a couple other things I want to show you in terms of editing here is most of the tools have a selection tool. So I'm pressing the inspector here in the top right, and I'm going and selecting various elements of my application. So let me take the sidebar footer over here. There's this border top line that doesn't actually exist in the application, and I want to get rid of it. So I can select it, and now I can give it what I want it to do in that specific area. So I'm going to say here, remove the border top. And so it's going to go ahead and move that line that you see to try to get it closer to my actual baseline. Now, the reason I call this out is by using the selection tool, you can make sure it makes the edits in the specific area you wanted it to, as opposed to sometimes when you don't scope it properly, it sort of makes edits elsewhere. Now, the other thing I want to call out is I kind of describe what I'm doing here as what I call technical editing. And the idea here is I know a little bit of HTML and CSS and the language that's typically used there. So it makes it easy for me to specify my edits using that language, right? So I said remove the border top. And if you know CSS, you know border top is a very specific border that gets placed on the top. And so I encourage people to get technical enough to be able to improve your prompts so you can be way more specific on the kinds of edits you're making to very quickly get what you want. Now, of course, you don't need to do that, but I do find the more specific you can be, the better it ends up being for ensuring you get to what your intention was. So I guess you're getting a sense here of the kinds of edits I can make to get this to look like my actual product. Now I'm going to fast forward here to a version that I've been working on that I've tried to get this to look as closely to my app as possible. So if you go back to the screenshot here and I look at this baseline, you can see that this baseline actually looks pretty good in terms of my actual application. Now, this took me, I'd say, about 30 minutes to get here. Now, here's the beauty. Now that I have this, this can be saved and used by everyone on the team. So no other PM has to go through this process. You can actually just start now designing features on top of this by using this baseline. And the way that works is you just name this project. And when you're ready to create a new feature on top of it, you just say duplicate. So we're going to do that here. And so now I'm going to duplicate it, and it's going to create a new project for me with that baseline. And so the idea here is I have my core NoChoi application already created, and now I can start prototyping new features on top of it. And that's what I want to show you next. And the reason we're doing this is now when I add new features to it, that feature by default will look exactly like the rest of my app. It's inheriting the designs of my application automatically. So let's actually start prototyping a feature. So I'm going to fire this off and then explain kind of what I'm asking it to do here. Since it's going to take a little while to go do the work. So NoChoi, one of the frequent feature requests we get is people would love to see AI features in the product. They're like, wouldn't it be awesome if in NoChoi I could ask an LLM questions about my notes? And it'd be better than just going to ChatGPT because it could leverage all the context of my specific notes to answer my questions. And so that's been something we've been toying around with, this idea, do we add AI features to NoChoi? And so I wanted to show you how I might go about prototyping that feature directly in NoChoi. Now, you'll see the prompt I put here was very broad. I said, I want to add an Ask AI feature to NoChoi to allow you to ask questions of your note, which will leverage an LLM and your note's content to answer the question. I'd like to explore a couple of different entry points into the Ask AI chat experience. It's now going off and actually going and prototyping that Ask AI feature for me. And so we'll give it a couple of seconds here to go do that. Now, one of the things I want to call out is the key thing about this is you can be broad in your actual explorations or very specific. And I wanted to show you a broad ask before we get into specific asks, because this is where it gets to the idea of playing with it, exploring, having the AI help come back with ideas as opposed to just actually build exactly what I wanted. So you can see one of the challenges these tools have is sometimes you run into bugs. And so it's attempted to write all this code, it's run into an issue, and now you ultimately have a bug here. Now, what's great is you can actually ask it to attempt to resolve that bug itself. And so I did that. I pressed attempt resolution. And luckily this time it worked. So it actually fixed the bug, and now we're back to our experience with the actual experience prototype. So now let me show you what it's done here. It actually created multiple entry points to this Ask AI feature. So it added one in the top right corner, said Ask AI. It added one in the toolbar here. At the bottom here, also Ask AI. And so it's showing me its own ideas of what might be interesting actual entry points to this. You can even see when I hover over the notes list, it's showing me that sparkle icon. And so all of these are going to open up the chat experience. And so part of this is just exploring with AI multiple different directions I could be going for that entry point. Now, maybe I'll pick one. And so I'll pick one. Maybe I'll have it remove the other ones. But let's take a look what happens when I actually enter it. Now, it's actually automatically come up with a chat window that it thinks might be appropriate for this Ask AI feature, right? So it's showing me this, giving me quick suggestions of questions you might want to ask. It has a question input box here. And, it's pretty cool that I got this with just a very generic prompt. And so it's actually allowing me to actually pull this up and show what that might look like. I wonder if I can even ask it questions here. So, okay, let's say we're looking at our Q1 note. Can you summarize this? And see what it comes back with. And so it's come back with a mock response, right? So it's showing me, hey, here's a summary of what this note is all about. And so what's cool about this is we're moving further than a static mock-up to actually seeing what the interaction experience might look like if this feature actually existed. Now, of course, right now it's still mock data, but the cool thing here is I'm able to actually see exactly what that experience might be. Now, I want to show you a different style of edit I might make when I'm asking it to build a feature. Now in NoteJoy, we already have these sidebars on the right hand. This is like a comment sidebar. And so what if I want it to build it not as this independent pop-up window, but as a sidebar? And so I can actually go in here and provide that screenshot as inspiration. So I say, I want to change the implementation of the Ask AI chat panel to be a right-hand sidebar that mimics the chatter sidebar in the text screenshot. And so this is another technique. You provide inspiration to it, and then it leverages that to ultimately build out the solution. And so you'll see here, that's exactly what's happened. It's created this sidebar that looks very similar to the chatter sidebar. It's a fixed pane sidebar, similar background colors. And so this is often a technique I use where I'm going to find some inspiration either already from my product or frankly from other products and feed it in as a way to really inspire what direction I want the design to go in. And so that's sort of that second level. You can be entirely broad where you're letting the AI figure out the design direction. You can provide inspiration, or of course, you can go in here and provide a mini spec of exactly how you want those interactions to work, and it will go implement it exactly as you'd like. So I hope you've gotten a sense now of how you can use tools like Bolt to start to prototype features in your actual product and get a sense of what that experience is going to be. A, without the work of having to spend a lot of effort with a designer to go mock this stuff up, but B, also getting into the interactions and what those interactivity will look like to see if that feels like a natural experience within the product. Now, the final thing I want to talk about here is you can take these prototypes and go beyond experience prototypes to actually functional prototypes. And so that's what I've done here. And so there's a couple things I've done to make this functional. The first thing I've done is added a couple of realistic notes into this prototype. And so, for example, this is a popular episode on Lenny's podcast with Brian Chesky. I just copied the full transcript of that video into here. I then got a great essay that Dan Hockenmeyer wrote about vibe analysis and copied the entire article summary into here. So these are starting to look like real notes that people would use. And I just prompted and told Bolt, hey, add a sample note with this title and this content, and it ultimately created it for me. Now, what I then asked it to do is, hey, I don't want you to just give me mock data. I want you to actually call the OpenAI LLM, GPT-5, and actually send it the question as well as the note content and give me the response. And so we're actually making this prototype functional. So it's actually going to go and work, right? And do the thing that I actually inspire for this feature to do if we build it. And so I've done that here, and I can even see what I might get. So I can say here, please summarize this YouTube video. And so the prototype now is calling OpenAI, sending not only my question, but also the note content, and it's going to come back with an actual response. And so we're seeing kind of a lag here with GPT-5, but we're going to get a summary of the video. Perfect. Here we go. And so let's see what we got here. The video is all about, founders shouldn't apologize for how they run their company, details about how they rework the product team. This is a very detailed summary, and it's super useful as I think about, would this actually be a useful feature to build? Not only from a visuals perspective, but from a functionality perspective, right? And so I can actually start testing, what this actual experience would look like before engineering even gets involved. Now, I even asked it to build a little model selector here at the bottom where I'm said, hey, maybe I want to play around with GPT-5 versus GPT-4. And so I can actually change this to GPT-4, ask it the same question, summarize this YouTube video, and see the difference in the response. Now, what's powerful about this is now I'm really getting into some of the technical requirements. Do I like a certain model better than another model when we ultimately go build out this functionality? What are the trade-offs between model choices? Is it useful to provide the user a selector on the models, or should I just make a decision up front? And so we're seeing the difference, for example, in the response that we got. And so I hope I'm opening your eyes to this idea that we can move beyond experience prototypes to functional prototypes to get us to better understand the experience and better play with whether this is going to be a useful experience for our users. And so that's the idea here of the prototyping. Okay, cool. So I'm going to jump back into the slides here. And I want to now talk about now you've built these beautiful prototypes of potential features that you want to build. What do you do with them, right? Like, how do you actually use that prototype? So I think there's a bunch of uses. This first one I think is often forgotten because I think it's actually probably the most value here, which is the main value is to help your team play with an idea and truly feel the experience and iterate with it, right? It's that idea that we want to play with it, try it out, use our own intuition and judgment based on playing with it to iterate on that experience. My favorite quote around this comes from Steve Jobs. He talks about this idea that there's a tremendous amount of craftsmanship in between a great idea and a great product. And as you evolve that great idea, it changes and grows. It never comes out the way you envisioned it. You get into the subtleties of it, right? And you find all sorts of trade-offs. There's certain things you can't make electrons do. There's certain things you can't make plastic do or glass do or factories do. Designing a product is keeping 5,000 things in your brain and fitting them all together in different ways to get what you want. And this is where I find prototypes add a ton of value. By moving beyond static mockups to actual designed experiences, to those interactions, that functionality, we can play with it in a higher fidelity form that then helps us create the better product, create the better experience for our customers. And so I really encourage folks not to lose sight as that as being a primary value of how to use the prototypes within the PM design engineering team itself. Now, another great use case for prototypes is as an alignment tool with executive stakeholders. Now, one of my favorite stories of this comes from Duolingo. The Duolingo team, as many of you know, builds some of the best language learning apps out there. If you want to learn a language, super easy to get Duolingo and start leveraging it for that. What folks might not know is Duolingo also offers a chess learning application. Now let's wind back to when they were considering adding this. They were doing their diligence, thinking about, hey, what other markets could we go beyond languages as we expand beyond that? And they were toying around with this idea of chess. But folks were kind of skeptical. Hey, look, does that move us too far away from our core? Do we really want to get in the business of chess? Maybe we should stick to languages. Now, what Edwin, one of their GPMs, did was he didn't sort of have these debates like that. He instead decided to build a prototype. He got one of these prototyping tools and started prototyping the core interactions. And his belief was that chess can be learned leveraging many of the same techniques that they use for language learners. This idea of spaced repetition, this idea of little puzzles. And so he prototyped that and showed what those experiences would look like. He then brought that to the executive team, and they were then ultimately bought off because now they could feel this truly felt like a Duolingo product, not just something where Duolingo is expanding beyond its sort of core market. And so that's really the power where now you can make the experience real. It ends up being really useful as a way to convince stakeholders beyond just using mockups or traditional strategy documents or PRDs to go do so. So that's a fantastic use case. Now, the other obvious use case here is validating with customers, talking to customers and showing these prototypes with customers, whether you're walking them through it, whether you're adding instrumentation so that you can actually watch the metrics. And the reason this is so important is the difference between express preferences and actual behavior. My favorite story on this comes from Sony. Back in the day, Sony was thinking about building a yellow Walkman, a sporty Walkman. So they have a focus group. And so they have a bunch of people come in to the focus group and they ask, what do you think of the yellow Walkman? Overall, the reception was positive. People were like, hey, look, it's sporty. I love that. It's a little bit more fun than the black Sony Walkman. Now, one of the researchers had this fantastic idea. Not only would they ask them what they thought about it, but at the end, as a reward, they said, hey, feel free to take a Walkman. Thanks for your time. They offered both yellow and black Walkmans. Here's the amazing part. 0 people took the yellow Walkman. Everyone took the black Walkman. And this illustrates this idea, hey, look, your express preference. You said yellow is cool, it's sporty, it's less boring than black. That express preference is very different oftentimes than your actual behavior. And the only thing that was the valuable lesson for them was the actual behavior. Everyone picked the black Walkman. And so that's sort of the notion here that if we only put static mockups in front of our customers, all we're getting is express preferences. If we put a prototype that they can actually use and feel, that they can come back to and see if they're coming back, you can now start measuring actual behavior, which helps us to validate far better than just from a static mockup world. And so that prototypes end up being a huge value for customer validation, more so than kind of what we're doing with static mockups. Okay, great. All right, so I want to now talk a little bit about the tools landscape and the tools that exist for doing this. Today, I showed you the actual demo of Bolt, but here are the 5 tools that I solidly recommend for AI prototyping. Bolt, V0, Replit, Lovable, and Magic Patterns. The reason is that all of these have what I consider sort of a core capability list that I think is really important for AI prototyping tools. Many of these things that we showed. Can you build functional prototypes? Can you do prompt to edit? Can you fork? Can you deploy? Can you collaborate? All those capabilities exist in all of these. And these tools have all gotten enough traction that I feel good about recommending them. So I encourage you to check them out. You can see they're all about the same price point. Now, the thing with these tools is that they all offer generous free plans, so you can try them all out yourself. But as soon as you start incorporating this in your workflow, you're going to hit those limits, and you're going to want to buy one of these tools. Now, let me kind of give you a little bit of my perspective on the difference between these. Bolt is really optimized for speed. It's part of the reason it's one of my favorite tools. It's just really fast. You're going to find you spend a lot of time in these tools waiting for your prompt to get a response. And so the speed in a tool like Bolt actually makes it incredible for using. Now, V0 in particular really optimizes for front-end UIs. Really trying to make that experience in the UI great. And so if you're really focused on front end, V0 is great to look at. Now, Replit really allows you to build robust, full stack applications with complete control of exactly what you want to build. So if you're really trying to recreate sort of an application, Replit's definitely one to check out. Now, Lovable has focused on this idea of non-technical users. So if you're intimidated by the code, they're trying to hide and obfuscate all of that. And so that's a great one to check out as well. Magic Patterns in particular really optimizes for product managers and designers. One of my favorite features of the tool is this inspiration feature that really allows you to say, hey, come up with 3 different design directions for this feature. And it will show you those different design directions. It'll let you explore them and fork them. And so that ends up being really cool as a way to check, to really optimize for the product and design use case. Now, in addition to those recommended tools, I did want to mention a few tools that are up and coming that are ones to watch. One of those tools is actually a tool that comes from the Reforge team itself. They're building something called Build, and it's really optimized for product teams. The particular thing I like about it is the problem with most of these tools is they're kind of in a silo. They don't have your product strategy. They have no notion of your customer feedback. They don't know your design system. So you have to provide all that context yourself. Now, what Build is trying to do is enable you to bring all that context into the prototyping tool so we can leverage that to really build that prototype for you. They're also doing a lot of cool stuff in terms of validating this stuff with your customers. So I think that's one to watch coming up. Now, some of the other key ones that are worth checking out is Figma has a tool called Figma Make. Now, this is, of course, going to be optimized for the design audience. If your team lives in Figma, I think you're going to worth checking this one out. I'll say today the tool's a little early, so it can't really compete with any of the other tools that I mentioned, but I'm sure they're going to fill in those gaps. Now, the last ones I want to mention is Google Firebase, as well as GitHub Spark. If your company lives in the Google or Microsoft ecosystem, these are going to be interesting tools for you to check out as you're thinking about solidifying a solution within your organization. Again, they're both pretty early. They don't yet have the same functionalities as the one as I recommend, but they're certainly ones to watch. All right. So we talked a lot about kind of getting started with prototyping, going from 0 to 1. I hope you guys have the tools to do that. I want to now talk about where do you go from here to really up level your skills in prototyping. So the first level I think about is the apprentice level. I imagine many of you are sort of at this level today. You've probably played with some of these tools. You might have attempted to build a prototype or two. And that's sort of kind of where you're at. You might realize that you can use these things to create experience prototypes. You might do simple edits like some of the edits I was showing, and you might have shown this to some colleagues. So I think this is where most people start. But I think the next level that is really worth aspiring to get to is what I call the journeyman prototyper. And so the idea of the journeyman here is that you're now starting to incorporate prototyping into your product workflow. It's a tool in your toolkit. When you're thinking about, okay, we're going to build a new feature, you think about, should I go build a prototype? And when you do that, you're starting to realize there's some core skills you need to develop in your prototyping capabilities to really be able to do that. Things like design consistency. How do we make sure these prototypes look like our actual product? And I showed you some of the ways you could do that. You're now starting to do that project management flow I mentioned of having shared baselines within your organization that encapsulate the core product experience from which you then fork and duplicate to then create new prototypes. And you sort of maybe adopted that as the workflow within your organization. Now, you are also using these tools to diverge, not just build the simple idea in your head, but also using it to ultimately diverge. Ultimately, you're going to realize half the value of this is to get feedback from customers, and you're getting really robust on the way you think about that. You might even have a built-in survey to collect feedback. You might instrument the product to get metrics as people are playing with the prototype. Now, at the same time, you're realizing the limitations of these tools. When to use a prototype and when not to use a prototype, but certainly prototypes don't answer all the core product questions. The final level I think about here is kind of the master prototyper level. And in this case, where you're getting to is prototyping is in fact reshaping your product development process. Now that you have this tool in your tool set, you're fundamentally changing the way you develop products in the first place. And so that is incredibly powerful once you get there. You're doing things like technical editing, the things I was describing. Maybe you're even going into the code and making some lightweight changes. You're expanding beyond experience prototypes to those functional prototypes, like I showed you, where you can actually have it call third-party APIs. You can even have a login and authentication within the prototype. You can have a database backend where you're storing data. So you've learned how to use prototyping to really build out functional prototypes. You're doing things like the inspiration sourcing that I was talking about, where you're really sort of starting to think about how do I actually source inspiration from other places that I can then feed into the prototyping tool to really inspire the direction of it. And so these are sort of the concepts that I'm seeing sort of the master prototypers get to. Now, as I mentioned, we only scratched the surface on this topic today. In my course, AI Productivity, we're going to be walking through that entire ladder and helping you build those skill sets. So if interested, if you're going further, I'd encourage you to check it out. As I mentioned, we have a cohort coming up in October. All right. With that, I want to open it up for questions. I'm going to invite Arch up here to help us a little bit with those questions.
Hello, just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, drop them into the Q&A, upvote other questions. That's how we're going to be prioritizing which ones we tackle live in this session after this awesome overview. So first up, there are a bunch of questions that came in via Barath, Kirsten, um, and a couple others about the relationship between PMs and UI UX professionals, designers, and what does collaboration look like moving forward? Um, you know, how does prototyping fit into this process? What do handoffs look like? And so I'll keep the question broad because there were a couple of iterations on it. But Sachin, I think a lot of the group would love to hear your thoughts on this.
This is a great question. And let me just start by prefacing these tools are so new. So I think many of us are still trying to figure out what is the right way to collaborate with these other team members as we're building out these prototypes. Now, let me give you a couple of archetypes I've now seen for this. The first is sometimes the idea here is you have ideas in your head as a PM that you want to communicate with your designer, but have never been able to because for you to open up Figma and start mocking things up is just too technical. But you could see you can build incredible experiences now inside these tools with just natural language. And so part of it is it's just a way for you to communicate better to the design team of where you want to go. And so I see PMs doing that as one way of actually doing it. Now, a second, I see actually PMs and designers coming together to collaborate on the prototype itself. So all of these tools that I recommended have incredible collaboration capabilities. So you can share that prototype. Both designers and PMs or engineers even could be prompting in there to actually create that experience. And so you can collaborate in that way. The third archetype I'm seeing, frankly, is actually designers themselves just embracing these tools, right? They're like, hey, I can put together things faster here than I can even in Figma. I can get to interactivity and functionality inside there. So that becomes interesting. Now, what I will say is sort of on the bleeding edge of this, we are seeing a blurring of roles. Before, the world was very sort of siloed between this is a PM's responsibility, this is a designer's responsibility. And with these tools becoming so accessible, I'm seeing many organizations start to blend these roles of PM, design, UX. And I think that's going to become more common as adoption of these tools continue.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Our next question comes in from Maitri. Got a lot of upvotes in the Q&A and also a lot of upvotes in chat. And Maitri asks, as product managers, we are often responsible for building strategy and have to think of innovative solutions for the products. Do you have any recommendations on tools to help think about the strategy for your product and then help with building the prototype of that idea?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Now, what's interesting about this is a prototype can help a little bit on certain strategic dimensions, but actually much of the strategy work will happen outside of the prototyping. And so let me give you that example. When we were talking about that chess, Duolingo expanding into chess, part of it, the strategic question was if they get into chess, would it leverage any of the best practices that they've built out at Duolingo for language learning? And the prototype helped communicate strategically it would. Because doing that in words is not as easy as doing that in the prototype. So that's an example of answering a strategic question via a prototype. Now, there's many strategic questions. How do we differentiate from the competitors in the market? Is there a big enough market opportunity for us to take on this niche? Those kind of strategic questions that the prototype does not answer. Now, you can leverage AI tools to actually get at that, right? We talk about this in the AI productivity course. We have a whole module on product strategy with AI. You could use it to do deep research to understand your market. You can even start looking at what customer segments are underserved by leveraging AI. You can even start asking it, where do you think the opportunities are? And so I think using tools like ChatGPT and many of the other LLMs is very useful for product strategy and a great complement to the work we're doing here on the prototyping side.
Yeah, totally. I love that call out about this prototyping not happening in a silo. And related to that, there's a question that comes in via Vivek, and there's a little bit of discussion about it. And it's all about what Vivek calls the AI tool chaining pipeline, going from, I'm guessing, early idea to prototype to generating code to passing it on to colleagues, building the feature, and discussion about, what does it look like to actually speed up development throughout this whole process that needs to happen. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
That's a great question. I'd say we're in the early innings right now where many of these tools feel fairly disjoint, right? We're talking about a category of prototyping tools. We then have our separate LLM tools. We then have the tools that engineers are using, like Cursor and Windsurf and whatnot, to actually be more productive. And so right now we're seeing a build out of all the core capabilities almost on a functional basis, right? Like, what does the PM need? What does the engineer need? But the next step is what you're describing, which is how do we make these tools talk to each other to really create end-to-end experiences? And we're starting to see those things actually emerge. So let me give you a concrete example in the AI prototyping world. There is now the ability to have your front-end engineers build out a design component library, right? These are all the widgets that you use to build your product, whether it's a sidebar or a calendar widget. And you can actually now have the AI prototyping tools use your actual design components. Now, the amazing thing about that is now when you're prototyping, you're using the actual code and components that your front-end engineers have used to prototype. Now, of course, that simplifies when engineering needs to actually go build that prototype. They're leveraging the existing components that already exist. There's nothing to be recreated. And so that's an example where this is at the frontier. The very bleeding edge organizations are starting to use actual design components in their prototyping to get there. I think we're going to see that continue to happen across all of the integration points. I was kind of describing design to engineering, but we're going to see that happen on the upfront world as well, where how do we get our product strategy, customer feedback into the prototyping tools as well?
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. There were a couple questions about, and it came coming in from different people, so I'm going to combine a couple here, but about what are other things that you can use in the prompting process during prototyping in order to get you to higher fidelity prototypes earlier. And so some examples are things like PRD documentation, wireframes if you already have them. Do you have any tips on how to approach that kind of increased fidelity?
Totally. So my number one tip is give it visuals. It turns out these tools are incredibly good at picking out from the visual what you're talking about and going and actually implementing it. So obviously I started with the no choice screenshot of the entire app and told it to recreate it. But that other example of taking inspiration from something that already exists and feeding that into there ends up being valuable. Now, the key thing is I'm often giving it inspiration not from my product, but from other products, right? The things I've seen out there that I want to collect and actually bring together. Now that I'm using these tools more often, I find myself like bookmarking more inspiration of third-party sites. There's even this incredible product called Mobbin, which all it does is basically have screenshots of every product out there that you'd want. I'm often going through it to get inspiration to then just copy the screenshot into the tool. So visuals are by far the number one thing you can do. Now, if you do have a spec, it will help. The key thing here is you need to think about it as a mini spec, not the full spec. I find if I just hand it the full spec, it really doesn't know what to do with that. But if I then piece out, here are the requirements for the specific thing I'm building, and give it to it piecemeal, the actual spec content will be equally useful for this. And so you kind of have to think about your spec a little bit more granularly to really get that to be valuable. But certainly that is also helpful to really get it to build kind of what you want it to.
Awesome. That's really great advice about kind of feeding it step by step too, so it knows what to pay attention to. Awesome. We're going to go a little bit more specific in this next question. And Richard asks about how prototyping tools like Bolt, for example, deal with IP, especially if you're feeding in all of this stuff that feels a little bit more proprietary. How do you think about that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I do think about in terms of what I'm feeding in as often like, hey, look, is if my product is out there, I'm going to consider a lot of people have access to what my existing product looks like, right? And so the screenshot I used, for example, was from a NoChoy demo account that we regularly demo with the notes that we've created in there. And so I do think that's generally a best practice, right? I didn't give it my NoChoy notes and fed it in there. I instead sort of used sort of more publicly available information and use that to feed it into the experience. And so that's one way that you can sort of feel kind of good about it. Now, of course, you're prototyping features that don't yet exist. And that's going to ultimately be sort of proprietary knowledge for your company. And so you're going to have to look at each of the company's sort of privacy policies. Now, many of these tools, ultimately, what they are wrappers around Claude code, right? They're using Claude models like Sonnet and whatnot in the back end. So they're sending your prompts to them, getting back the generated code and creating that beautiful UI around it. Now, understanding the privacy policies of companies like Claude and Anthropic and knowing that they don't train based on the data that you put in their own models is important to really get to that level of safety with each of these tools. Now, of course, the tool itself does have that data that it's storing, and it's important to feel comfortable with that and reviewing sort of the privacy policies of each of these tools.
That totally makes sense. And I think we have time for one last question. And this one comes in via Dante. And I know you covered this a little bit earlier, but Dante asks if you could walk through at a high level what it looks like to take this prototype from a prototype to live to production.
Yeah, great question. So normally what to think about here is the next phase after I built what I've done is to go and socialize this, right? I'm going to take it to my team, my designs engineers. We're going to iterate on it based on the experience. I'm going to take it to my execs, get some feedback on it. I'm going to put this in front of customers where all the tools allow you to deploy it to a URL. And then at that point, you can actually start getting feedback, right? You can even instrument analytics in these tools by just telling it to do so and start to see that. And so that would be the next phase of what I'm going to do. Now the question becomes, how do I get this into production? Now, let me tell you, I've seen a few things that people go and do. One is they hand the prototype to the engineers like you would a spec, right? Normally you give them a spec with some design mockups. Now it's like a spec plus a spec plus a prototype. And now when they're looking at this and recreating this on their own, they're actually seeing what the interaction you intended was in those experiences, right? Like in the chat window, I want it to fly out and be a fixed sidebar panel. The fact that they can see that enables them to then translate that to a higher fidelity than a static mockup would enable them to. Now, in that mode, they're not using the code. And frankly, most of the time, that is what I'm seeing today. With larger organizations that are usually not using the code, they're using it for design specifications. They may look at the code to see what it's doing, to see, oh, okay, I see, like, this is the way you prototype it. This is how it's calling the LLM or whatnot. And then they might use that as inspiration for their own code. Um, that's frankly kind of the state of the art where most people are. Now, in some cases, people are taking a bit of the code and trying to fly with it. I find that might work in sort of a lightweight MVP that you want to get out there, but rarely is going to work. You want to get this as a production system that lots of users are banging on in the real world.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sachin, for answering all those questions. Thank you to everyone that participated in the chat and asked great questions. I learned a ton today. Sachin, before I hand it over to you, just want to say thank you again. This was a great session. I learned a lot just seeing how you approach prototyping, and I'm very excited to see more in your AI productivity course.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. Love the questions. Loved how you guys engaged deeply with this. And happy prototyping.